Well, good to see you. Welcome back. We are in a series that we are calling Senseless. And so if you were here last week, or even if you weren't, we're going to catch you up. So I encourage you to go back and listen to the podcast. You can stream it wherever you can find podcasts. It's kind of all over. Any service that you use, you can find it there. But we have been talking about how God gave us these incredible abilities to see and to hear and to smell and taste and touch, but how most of us actually spend our lives in our heads, not in our bodies. Like we're overthinking everything, we're overanalyzing everything, we're second guessing everything, we're like projecting into the future, we're trying to figure things out, we're trying to problem solve, instead of actually being present in the moment in which we're living. And maybe when you hear that, I think most of us kind of hear this idea and we go, yeah, okay, I understand that. That might not be like an ideal for us, that our lives would be a little bit better if we were a little bit more present in them. But as problems go, I mean, that seems kind of small. So why the heck are we actually talking about this in church? Which I think is really a good question and a reasonable one. And the answer is because I think if we're not tapped into our senses, and this is kind of the premise of the whole series, is that it's possible that we may not just be missing out on life, we may actually be missing out on God. And so all month long, we've been coming back to this verse from Jeremiah chapter 5, verse 21, where God says this to his people. He says, "Listen, you foolish and senseless people with eyes that do not see and ears that do not hear." And God used those words to describe people who had eyes that worked, but they couldn't see. They had ears that worked, but they couldn't hear. And so as a result, they were unaware that he was right in front of them, that he was right next to them. They had no idea of the activity that was all around them that God was at work in. And so we've been asking the question, and I want to ask you this morning, like, is it possible that God's been trying to get your attention, but you can't hear it, but he can't get your attention because your senses are dulled? I wonder, what is it that's right in front of you that you're not seeing? What is it that God might be saying to you that you can't hear? Part of what complicates all of this for us is that we often disconnect kind of the physical from the spiritual, that we have things that are spiritual and we have things that are physical, and those two never kind of come together. But in the story, in the scriptures of us and God, God regularly uses tangible sensory experiences in the physical world for our bodies to help us experience and understand and connect to spiritual truth and spiritual realities, the things that he actually wants us to see and know, not just about ourselves, but about him. So a while back, my wife and I, Hansi, we've been married 29 years, and this is, if you want to know, like if you are just thinking about getting married or you've been married shorter, like I just want to give you a window of what you can look forward to. So we're driving in the car, and she was perturbed because people like me. And so she was like, I don't understand why everybody likes you. And she said these words, I'm not kidding. She said, I'm a better person than you. And I don't particularly remember what warranted this all of a sudden attack, but I will say she is right. And there's lots of different evidence and examples, and she started giving me plenty. But one of the examples of how she's a better person than me is when we fly. So when we fly, when we get on a plane, she talks to people. She engages with people. She's hardly ever been on a flight where she didn't get somebody's life story and exchanged numbers with them and texted them later and prayed for them and prayed with them. When she only spent a couple of hours or even a few minutes talking with these people, but something about her, people just want to tell, they just want to throw up their life and everything that's going on when they talk to her. Me, on the other hand, when I'm on the plane, don't talk to me. Don't look at me, don't talk to me, get away from me. From the moment I sit down, I put in my noise-canceling headphones and my AirPod Pros, and I'm just like, leave me alone. I want to tune out the world. Anybody else like that? Anybody, am I alone? Okay, I'm not alone. There's a few of us that are bad people and don't want to talk to anybody. I appreciate that. And honestly, I'm perfectly content and happy that there are better people in the world than me, like my wife, who want to talk to other people. Just leave me alone. You guys meet up and talk together. Leave those of us that don't want to talk by ourselves. But I remember when I got my first noise-canceling headphones. I mean, talk about a game changer. I didn't even know that I needed them till I got them, and I'm like, where have these things been my whole life? Anybody know what I'm talking about when you have that? Or have you ever felt like you could just use a little bit more peace and quiet in your life? Well, shoot, I do all the time, right? The saying goes, silence is golden. But as it turns out, sound and even actually noise is a bigger deal for us than maybe we realize. So several years ago, I read an article about these ultra quiet noise canceling rooms that exist all over the world. And they're so quiet, they measure the sound in negative decibels because they're so quiet the way they construct them. But they're so quiet that most people, when they go in them, they find them disturbing because within a few minutes, your ears adjust to the quiet and people can hear their heartbeat. They can hear the blood flowing through their veins. They actually can hear their eyelids close. They hear all of their bodily noises, the way that the machine of their body is just working. And it's pretty disturbing. But even beyond disturbing, most people experiencing those rooms get really disoriented. So much so that after 30 minutes, they actually have people sit down because people just start falling over. They have trouble walking or even standing. It throws off their equilibrium. And after 45 minutes, the majority of people who are in these rooms start hallucinating. It's so quiet, they start actually hallucinating and hearing things that aren't there and imagining things. Isn't that crazy? See, it turns out, and this was kind of the point of the article, it turns out that we tend to focus on sight, but sound is fundamental to how we orient ourselves in the world, including just our physical sense of balance. Now, beyond that, think about how much hearing shapes your everyday experiences. We have sounds that wake us up, and we have sounds that put us to sleep. Anybody sleep with a fan? Anybody have a little ocean noise playing somewhere in your room? You got something little going on, right? Obviously, music is incredibly powerful and important. There's good music, and then there's country music. If you work out, you probably have a playlist that gets your blood pumping. Last week, we were having breakfast with our daughter, and I realized at one point that I was singing along to a song that I wasn't even really aware was playing, and I didn't know how or why I knew the song. I can't remember this song. I couldn't remember knowing it, learning it. I was like, why do we know this song? And then I looked it up, and she was like, oh, it's Train, and it's this, and this is why I know it. I was like, oh, probably because you listened to it. That's why I know it. I don't want to listen to this song. Even sounds that you didn't actually hear can impact your life. If you're married and you're a guy, you ever slept through a noise in the middle of the night, but your wife didn't? You didn't hear it, but she did. That's going to impact your life, right? That's fun, right? Sound is so powerful that what we hear can affect us emotionally. It affects our moods, right? And we don't just identify sounds, we assign meaning to them. And that's because actually, biologically in your brain, your brain processes sound in your amygdala, which is also where you process emotions. And so that's why sounds can move us, and music moves us, and things and voices can move us so emotionally and affect us so deeply in our moods. And so we all have sounds in our culture that help us focus and relax and study and party. And we haven't even talked about communication yet. Medical science tells us that from the time that we're born, our brains are wired to pick up speech. That even as babies, newborns, we prefer voices over any other sound that we hear. Our brains light up and respond to voices in ways that they don't to any other sound. The average person can recognize the voices of hundreds of people that they know, even when you can't remember their name. You're like, I know that voice. And nothing, of course, connects us with one another like laughter or crying. You ever watched a movie that was just sort of funny, but then you saw it again with the right group of friends and you laughed so hard that your face hurt? Of course. Or you ever had somebody step into a moment of pain in your life and just sit and cry with you? So outside of the life of Jesus, Romans 12 is maybe my favorite chapter in the whole Bible. In Romans 12, the Apostle Paul, who wrote these words, who wrote this as a letter to a church in the city of Rome, he wrote these words, and if you've been around church, you've probably heard them, but he wrote this in Romans 12:15. He said, rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. And notice that he doesn't just say be sad with sad people and be happy for happy people. No, he says rejoice with those who are rejoicing and weep with people who are weeping, both of which are physical, both of which are audible. There's power and depth and empathy to them. There's language to them that we just don't have words for. And I don't think it's coincidental that we can both laugh and cry long before we can speak. But just like we talked about last week with seeing and sight, all seeing, all sight, it's not all the same. So there's different kinds of hearing, right? We don't just hear. When we listen, like we sort and we contextualize what we heard, right? We can aim our direction, our attention in a specific direction. Right? When we hear something, we actually turn our focus and lean in and try to hear what's going on over there. We attempt to understand, like did you hear me? Like, am I being heard? We consider other people's perspectives. And ultimately, like the proof that we've actually heard something is actually when we take action. We certainly all know, as I just said, the difference between somebody hearing us and hearing what we said and what it feels like to actually be heard. If you're a person of faith, these ideas have profound spiritual implications because they're everywhere in the scriptures. I mean, God talks about noise and speaking and hearing and listening and deafness all over the place. Just a few examples in Psalm 119, David says that it's God's word. It's his words that create light for his path. In Romans 10, this same guy that we just read, Paul, he says that faith comes from hearing, that it's hearing the message, the truth of who Jesus is and what he did that actually creates the environment and makes faith possible for us. In John chapter 10, Jesus says that his followers know the sound of his voice. In James 1, he says we should all be quick to listen and slow to speak. And on and on and on it goes. So there's a story in the Old Testament about words and hearing and focusing and reacting, and I've always found this story fascinating. It's about a guy named Elijah, and he's considered one of the greatest prophets who ever lived. He did and saw so many amazing things. Just a few highlights from his life. You can find them all in the scriptures. He prayed for a drought and it happened. Like it didn't rain for 3 years because he prayed and said, God, close up the heavens, don't let the rains come. When he had no food, God sent ravens with food to feed him. That's a cool trick. He prayed for a little boy who had died and God brought him back to life. Part of the reason I love Elijah is because he's got kind of a little bit of a swagger. He's kind of mouthy and sarcastic, which I know a little bit about. And Elijah wasn't afraid to make a little bit of a show of the things that God was having him do. He was kind of like the Han Solo of prophets. Brave, a leader, kind of a cavalier, just go for it. So in 1 Kings chapter 18, there's a showdown between Elijah and a whole bunch of people that chose to make themselves the enemies of God. There were 850 prophets of these other false gods, and then there was Elijah. So it was a showdown, 850 to 1. But Elijah isn't scared. He's unflappable. He's not rattled. In fact, he's the opposite. He's kind of a little cocky, if like in a good way. And it's no contest. If you might know the story, God shows up in a massive way. Elijah prays a very simple prayer. God sends fire from heaven. It blows everybody away. And then per the instructions of God, God has Elijah kill all the false prophets. I think before we get to the part of the story that I want to read with you, just hearing that, I think if we're honest, we all want those fire from heaven moments. We all have those things that we think, if God ever just did this thing for me, I mean, it would change everything. And I'd never doubt him. I'd always follow him. I'd never freak out again. I'd always believe. But look at what happens in Elijah's story in 1 Kings 19. So Ahab, who is the king, he tells Jezebel, his wife, everything that Elijah had done and how he had killed all of the false prophets with the sword. And so Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow and do not make your life like the life of one of them. Now, maybe you don't know a lot about Ahab and Jezebel, but Ahab was an evil king. You also know that nobody's ever named their daughter Jezebel in the history of humanity, which is a pretty good sign that she wasn't a walk in the park. Right? So he was the king, but she was the real power player between them. And so she gets the report, and she flips out, and she sends this messenger to the prophet of God. I mean, this is like intense, right? This guy just prayed, and fire came down from heaven. He just faced off 850. She doesn't care. She's like, oh yeah? Bring it on. Like, I will kill you. You're dead meat. Remember, like, Elijah had just seen this incredible moment. You would think that something like that should hold you for at least a week, right? Like you would just be like, yeah, I'm good, I'm solid. Just a couple days ago, I saw fire come out of the sky. But not so fast. Check out what happens. Verse 3, it says, Elijah was afraid, and he ran for his life. And he went a day's journey into the wilderness, and he sat down, and he prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord. He said, take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. Hey, have you ever been just having a normal day and everything's good, but then you hear something and it kind of rips the carpet right out from underneath you? In June of 2016, some of you know the story, my nephew, who was 10 years old and perfectly healthy, went to bed, had a massive seizure in his sleep, and died. I was out for a run that morning, and my phone was ringing, and I didn't answer it because I was running. I got back to my room. I saw that I had missed a couple of calls, and one of them was the Sacramento County Sheriff. Said, Mr. Sherwood, is the Sacramento County Sheriff. We're calling you. Please call us back. We're calling on behalf of Bo and Rochelle Sherwood, my brother and his wife. And so I called him back, and it was just very informational. She said, I'm calling on behalf of Bo and Rochelle. They asked me to call you and tell you that Brady Sherwood had a seizure in his sleep last night and he didn't make it. What? What are you talking about? You ever have something like that? Maybe it wasn't that tragic. It didn't have to be that devastating to send you for a loop. It could have just been a rumor. It could have just been a voicemail. It could have been a diagnosis or a call from your kid's school. Most of the time when we hear something like that we don't want to hear, our first instinct is kind of like Elijah, is to panic instead of to actually stop, take a deep breath, and pray. Well, I mean, clearly Elijah's a prophet, and he's way more spiritual than us, so, he does the same exact thing that we would do. And so it tells us that he went a day's journey into the wilderness, which I think is really interesting because that imagery is unmistakable. Because his soul is all of a sudden in a wilderness, and so he goes to the wilderness. See, the truth is we end up creating a world on the outside that just mirrors our world on the inside. And then we blame God. How did we end up here? Why am I out here? Why didn't you help me? What's going on? Where are you? And so right on cue, it's only after he's done panicking. Then Elijah prays. And he doesn't pray one of those epic, faith-filled, life-changing prayers that he prayed in chapter 18. No, he's like, that's it, God. I'm done. Just kill me now and get it over with. I love how God handles it. In verse 5, it says, then he, Elijah, laid down and fell asleep. And an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. And Elijah looked around, and there by his head was a large pepperoni pizza and a 6-pack of crumble cookies. Because we all know when you're having a bad day, crumble cookies make it better. But there was bread baked over hot coals and a jar of hot water, and he ate and drank, and he laid down again. When you read that, as beautiful as that is, right? That God's like, hey, I just want to feed you and help you, and you take a nap and get some rest. Why didn't God answer him? Why not set everything straight right then? Why not be like, hey, listen, you need to get back in the game. Have you ever tried to have a conversation, or even especially an important conversation with somebody who's either super hungry or tired or scared or angry, and you're just like, hey, what's the problem? You're not listening. It just doesn't go well. And there's so many times where I'm like, babe, honestly, just give me some tacos and then we can talk. Just feed me so I can focus. So God doesn't even try to talk to Elijah until he gets some sleep and he gets some food. See, maybe the reason why you're struggling with hearing the things that you need to hear, maybe the reason why you're struggling with hearing the voice of God speak in your life is just because you actually just need to get some rest. Maybe the most spiritual thing you can do in your life is take a nap. Actually go to bed on time. Change your diet a little bit. Feed your body something a little bit better than the junk food you're feeding it. So in the story, God actually gives Elijah a second meal. And this is what it tells us afterwards. It says, so he got up and he ate and drank, and the food gave him enough strength to travel 40 days and 40 nights. That is a God meal right there. If you eat one time and you got enough strength to go for 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. And there he came to a cave where he spent the night. But the Lord said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? Okay, so this is the first time that he hears from God, but God doesn't give him an answer. He asks him a question, which I think is really, really interesting, because God often uses questions to bring us to the answers that we need, not the ones that we're looking for or that we want or that we're demanding. And so God shows up and he doesn't answer the question of what's going to happen with Jezebel or what he needs to do next. No, he just says, what are you doing here, Elijah? And by the way, Elijah didn't have to lose himself in the wilderness for God to speak to him. I mean, the truth is, for you and I, getting away from the noise of your life, it does allow you to turn down the noise in your soul, but you don't have to go abandon your life or get lost in the wilderness in order to do that. Your life may be noisy and loud and chaotic, but your mind and your heart don't have to be. And so God comes to him and says, what are you doing here? And it's not this sarcastic, disgusted, sort of judgmental question that maybe we perceive it to be. It's God in gentleness and compassion and love saying, why? How did you end up here? And this guy who fearlessly stared down 850 prophets by himself, this guy who's normally full of faith and swagger, is now just kind of whiny. Look at how he answers God. He says, I've been very zealous for the Lord. And the Israelites have rejected your covenant, and they torn down your altars and put your prophets to the death, and I'm the only one left. And they're trying to kill me too. And the interesting thing about what he says is that what he's saying isn't true. I mean, it's partially true, but he's not the only one. Some of that stuff happened, but it's like a massive exaggeration because he's just flooded emotionally. See, the truth is, if we're honest, our feelings aren't determined by the facts of our situation. They're determined by where we choose to place our focus, by what voices and noises that we choose to let in and pay attention to. Which is why, in his situation, you can be completely safe and still be afraid. It's why your life, by any objective measure, can be beautiful and amazing, and yet you still be miserable because you're focused in on one thing. Because all you can think about is what they said or what you heard or just maybe even what you just thought you heard. And so God tells Elijah to go outside the cave and stand on the mountain, and the whole thing kind of comes to a head in this way. In verse 11, it says, Elijah stood there, and the Lord passed by, and a mighty windstorm hit the mountain. It was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was the sound of a gentle whisper. Maybe you know this story. Maybe you noticed it as we're reading it. Maybe it never occurred to you. That God tears apart the rocks with the wind, and he shakes the earth with an earthquake, and he sends fire from heaven, which he had done before. All these things that Elijah could see. but God wasn't in any of them. And then comes a gentle whisper. Then comes a still, small voice. And that whisper is what changed everything for Elijah. Not because his situation changed, but it changed just hearing that voice, changed how he saw himself, how he saw his situation. It says when Elijah heard it, when he heard that still, small voice, he wrapped his face in his cloak and he went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Now, that doesn't mean a whole lot to us, but it's actually not an incidental part of the story. See, it's powerful imagery to the people when this was originally written, when they read this, because it would have demonstrated for them that he had a complete shift in his perspective. Because it's him realizing who's on his side. It's him realizing who he's been talking to. It's him going like, oh, I need to cover my face because I forgot for a minute, but I know who you are. I know that nobody can see you and live. I know I've seen what you're capable of. I know what you can do. I forgot my place. I know who you are. I need to cover my face. So I'm going to cover my face because I'm ready for what's next. See, I have no doubt that there are things that God wants to show you, regardless of whatever your background or history of church or faith or God or the Bible. There is no doubt in my mind that God wants to show you things, that he wants to show himself to you. But if you're only open to one kind of interaction with God, you'll end up missing out on where he wants to take you in your life. Because you were designed to hear from God. And he wants to take you places that you could never go on your own. But it will require for you to listen to him as he goes on ahead of you and for you to follow him as he leads you. Most of the time in our life, we're only listening to what's noisy, what's shiny, what's flashy, what's crazy, what's showy. And then we wonder where God is and why we can't hear him. And I don't understand. Well, what if your problems aren't the problem? What if the problem is ears that have been deafened to the voice of God? Over and over and over again, when you open the scriptures, when God speaks, everything changes. His voice always makes a way and opens doors and sets free and brings healing and gives life every time he speaks. God doesn't want you to ignore the issue that you're facing. He doesn't want you to ignore the situation that you're in, but he does want you to trust him and live and act and move forward based on what he's saying, not what you can see with your eyes. He wants you to allow his words to light your path, to let what he says to guide you through it when you can't see clearly. And if you will, like Elijah, the rest of you will eventually catch up. Your perceptions, your feelings about your situation will eventually catch up to the voice, the whisper that's happening in your soul. See, God will challenge you and confront you and comfort you and correct you, all by helping you hear something. But you got to listen for what you can learn. You got to listen for what he's saying, not just what's loud and flashy, not just what sounds easier, like less work, like the easier path. And so the question for us this morning is like, well, what does God sound like? What does that actually feel like? What does that mean? How do we hear it? What is he saying? Well, I can tell you that I'm just smart enough to answer those questions in a way that won't be super satisfying to you and will probably leave you a little bit disappointed. But I can tell you this, if you want to know what the voice of God is like, in the moments where you're moving towards despair, his voice will be the one telling you that there's hope. When you're filled with fear, his voice will be the one rising up and telling you to be strong and have courage. When hatred and vengeance are filling your life, his voice will be the one eating away at it, pulling you towards love and forgiveness and compassion. When you're lost, he will guide you through. When you're drowning in doubt, his voice will speak faith. See, God's voice is always going to be the one that's calling you toward your best self, always going to be the one that's calling you towards sacrifice, toward the good, towards faith and hope and love. His voice will always be the one who's calling you towards Jesus. See, when you open the scriptures, God speaks most clearly and most fully through Jesus. It's undeniable. We talked a little bit about this last week in setting this conversation up, but one of the things that Jesus repeated a lot, almost more than any of his other sayings, is that he talked about us having ears to hear. He said it 16 different times, or at least it's recorded 16 different times in the Gospels. And it's kind of an odd thing to say. I mean, we kind of intuitively know what he meant, but what else do you do with ears but hear with them? But Jesus seemed to believe that it was possible for him to be right in front of us, for us to be listening to his words and still completely miss what he was saying. And like we know, like if you're a parent, you know exactly what that's like, because you're like, do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? To your kids, and they heard you, and then they went and did the other thing, and they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. You've been in moments where no matter how hard you tried, you couldn't help two people who were talking past each other. They just couldn't hear each other. They couldn't seem to understand. And I think if we're honest, we all have opinions and preferences that actually contradict what Jesus would say and the direction that he would lead us. And we don't want to admit that to ourselves, especially in church, because to disagree with Jesus is to sort of set ourselves against God, and that's not how we want to see ourselves, especially if we're a Jesus follower. But sometimes that's exactly who we are and how we behave. And so I want to tell you this morning, if Jesus agrees with you and is on your side about everything, you're not following Jesus. You're following you. And you're making Jesus say it for you. And here's how you know. Because Jesus said following him would feel like and require us dying to ourselves every single day. See, the challenging thing about hearing God's voice is you have to decide whether to listen and to follow. One of the things that Jesus repeatedly gets at, one of the things that God repeatedly says through the scriptures, is that when we hear his voice, if we do not follow it, that eventually we grow deaf to being able to hear it at all. And that's the tricky part, because he often leads us to places we don't want to go. He often leads us to do things that we don't want to do. I don't want to forgive them. I don't want to love them. I don't want to talk to them. I'm on this plane. Don't talk to me. I'm going to put my headphones in. In Elijah's story, God sent him right back into the situation to go and face it that he had run away from. And I honestly think more often than not, he does the same with us. Whatever that thing is that you've been trying to get away from, whatever that thing is that you've been running from, whatever that thing is that you've been trying to avoid, maybe the reason why you can't ever fully escape it is because God wants you to face it. And so you keep trying to put it in the rearview mirror, and God keeps bringing it back around. Here it comes again. Several years ago, quite a few years ago, I was working at a church in Las Vegas, and it ended poorly. And I ended up getting fired, and there was a lot of like drama and mistreatment and all kinds of crazy stuff. It was a really dysfunctional situation. And I moved on and didn't think twice. And we left Las Vegas and moved to the North Bay of San Francisco, and everything that had happened to us, God paid us back and more. I mean, I had no reason to be bitter, but I was bitter for a long time. And I didn't want to think about this guy. I just wanted to forget him. I just wanted to forget him and the situation. But the problem is at the time, we were part of the same organization. And so every year, every few months, it was like, here it comes again. Oh, that's a reminder. And I remember standing up in a service just like this one, and I got to a point about forgiveness, and it just hit me like a ton of bricks. And God's going this is why you can't get away from this, because you need to forgive. And I'm like, he doesn't even think he did anything wrong. He didn't ask me to forgive him. He's like, I didn't ask you if he asked you. I just told you need to forgive him. And so I wrote a letter that I didn't want to write. maybe God keeps bringing that thing back around because he wants you to face it. But here's the good news. You don't have to face it alone. He's with you. He's with you. And so my question for you this morning is, what or who is it in your life that you've been unable to hear? What is it that God might be trying to say to you that you've just missed out on? What is it that he's putting right in front of you and you keep trying to push it to the side, but he's going, you need to deal with this? What relationship is strained or tense right now because you just can't hear one another? What's the noise that's causing the static or the distortion, making it impossible for you to hear, that you need to actually reduce or eliminate? And for some of us, that might be a place that we spend too much time in. And we know, and it's not necessarily a bad place. We just spend a lot of our time there. And so it just fills our thoughts, and the noise and all of the sounds from that experience are really just always in our head. Maybe it's some media or some habit or some thought pattern that's just on loop. And you go, man, I got to actually turn this noise down so I can hear what's being said. Where is it that you need to direct or redirect your attention? What perspectives do you actually need to consider? And maybe most of all, what action have you been putting off? And you're going, I hear you, God. And he's going, well, then do it. Follow me. Forgive. Help. Reach out. Serve. Sacrifice. I don't want to. Take action. Finally, Elijah traveled all the way to the mountain of God before he heard from God. If you are not a follower of Jesus, the beautiful reality is that you don't got to do that. He closed all that distance between you and him. That he came to us. You don't got to go to the mountain of God. He comes to you. That he's right here, right now. His voice whispering into your soul, inviting you into relationship, inviting you into life, inviting you to turn, to shift, to step forward, to see the thing that you're facing in a completely different way. He's inviting you into faith in him.
South Hills Church, I just want to take a moment and say thank you for watching our service online. Whether you're watching it for the first time or you're watching it again because you enjoyed the service so much from the weekend, I'd like to take a moment and dive into our giving. Every week we give people the opportunity to give back and give to the local church so that God can continue to bless your lives and bless your finances. Here at South Hills, we believe that everything comes from God. We believe that he's the one that chose us and brought us into this world, gave us our gifts and talents and abilities. And I just want you to know that when we give, we are giving back what God has already given to us. If you've ever seen any of our envelopes at a South Hills campus, you'll see on there that it says, every week at South Hills, your generosity is giving people the opportunity to live a better story. And there's a scripture on there in Matthew chapter 6, verse 21 that says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So I want to encourage you today to click down below and set up your giving, whether it's for the first time or whether you're doing reoccurring giving. We have 4 ways to give here at South Hills. 1, you can do it in person at any of our campuses through an envelope. Or 2, you can actually text any amount that you would like to 84321. And the third way is to download our Church Center app. I encourage you to do this one because the Church Center app gives you opportunity to stay connected with our church and your campuses. It's a great tool and resource for you to know what's going on. And the 4th way to give is to give online. You can go to southhills.org/give and you can set up your giving there. Whether you're a guest of our church or whether you are a member of our church, or whether you simply just like to watch our services, I encourage you to trust God with your finances so that he can bless and anoint your finances and you can be trusting God in this journey of living life to the fullest. I love you and thank you for watching our online service today.